Hello everybody, my name is Moses Cornejo. I'm doing this week's chapter outline and presentation on chapter 3, Constructionist Theories. The chapter first goes into labeling theory. Labeling theory is a version of symbolic interactionism. Within this theory, there's two main points that the chapter spoke about, basically interaction and symbolic. Interaction is basically the deviance as a collective action involving more than one person's act. Rather than focusing on the deviant person alone, interaction between the deviant person and other conventional people, focusing on who commit a deviant act in the rest of society with several groups. One cannot coexist without the other. Symbolic, the interaction between supposed deviant and the conformist, is governed by the meanings that they are attributed to each other's actions and reactions. The labeling comes how people react to said symbols, significant gestures, interpretations, definitions, or labeling itself. A negative response means there is deviance, while a positive response means there is no deviance whatsoever. Dynamic process of symbolic interaction between both deviant and non-deviant. So who labels who? Labelers can include the police, judges, prison guards, psychiatrists, mental hospital attendants, and other social control agents. While the label can include criminals, juvenile delinquents, drug addicts, mental patients, and prostitutes. The consequences with labelings is that an individual who is labeled as deviant are more likely to consider themselves as deviants. Within this, there's primary deviance and secondary act. So, primary deviance is when the individual considers an act innocent, while others consider it deviant. For example, a child may be running around throwing rocks at a vehicle, while obviously the owner of that vehicle is going to see these kids as juvenile delinquents. They're going to call the police, talk to their parents. And at this point, it's when secondary act comes into play, when both the individual and the rest of society consider an act as deviant. So now both the child and the supposed people that they threw the rocks at and whatnot, they're gonna all come to a conclusion that they're deviant. And labeling theory focuses on how individuals can go from primary deviant to secondary deviance, is basically what I just mentioned. Consequences of the labeled can produce more deviant behavior, along with more tendency to encase themselves as the deviant person they are being labeled as. This consequence can lead the label to further their deviant skill as a deviant person. So, if you're a robber robbing a convenience store, you're gonna eventually further those skills of robbing a store. You can maybe going on to robbing a bank, and that's basically what the issue is that the more you're getting labeled as deviant, the further you're gonna further those skills, and eventually that's gonna be part of your living. There's a consequence with the labelers, which creates a sense of power among those who are labeling others as deviant. So like I said, police, judges, the issue there is that they are the ones who create the distinction between good and evil. So basically, if a judge presses charges on this one person who knows they are innocent on murder, the judge is the one who's going to decide that, not the person themselves. So that's kind of the issue there. Evaluating labeling theory has become popular among sociologists due to the way it is easily demonstrated the significance of human interaction. This theory is often questioned due to the way it focuses on labeling rather than looking at the psychological part of the person. The role of the powerful imposing labels on others typically follows the rich and the powerful, creating deviance for the poor and the powerless. So the next thing the chapter goes into is phenomenological theory. It's another version of symbolic interactionism. Also, this theory has been referred to ethnomethodology, existential sociology, creative sociology, and sociology of everyday life. This theory itself critiques positivism because they focus on the deviant subjectivity rather than their own in accordance with deviance. They examine the objectivity of deviance, while positivists focus on the conception of deviance rather than looking at the perception and experience. Subjectivism as a key to deviant reality. It relies on people's subjective interpretations of deviance to understand deviance itself. Ethnography as an application of phenomenology, a research method that seeks to understand the meaning of people's experiences. So the perception can be of a robber. Basically, they wake up every morning, they cook breakfast, they go to sleep like all of us, but they are considered deviant due to the way obviously they are perceived as deviant. They themselves do not consider themselves deviant because they are basically just living their own life and living normal. Well, our everyday 9 to 5 type of job is normal, and they're every day, 10 a.m. robbery is normal to them. Evaluating this theory, there is no accurate definition of understanding deviance, while they still cannot come up with a way to prove this theory is better over others, like labeling theory and whatnot. The chapter then goes into deviance as drama and warrior narrative, so dramaturgy and stigma. So stigma, there's 3 different forms of stigma. Abominations of the body, which is, it kind of talks about obesity, scars, birthmarks. And the next part of stigma is blemishes of an individual character. So it could be extreme passions, incarceration, mental illness. And finally, the last one's tribal stigma. This is basically when there's a disenfranchised racial groups and religion. The drama part of this is the way of conceptualizing human life and its components. So impression management as a way to consciously manipulate their audience to perceive them as a certain way. Thus come the drama part. So, you manipulate the way you talk to your professors, or when you're on a job interview, you're going to sit there and you're going to, act a certain way rather than the way you act at home is different. Obviously, on Zoom, you're going to be acting normal, and at home, you can be acting completely different, FaceTime with your friends. It's all part of the drama part. The warrior narrative is the performative nature of an individual in regards to a narrative masculinity. So boys typically will engage into like masculinity by playing with cars. They typically have a police chase. You ask a boy, they're like, "What are you doing there?" "You're playing with cars." There's a police chase. While girls typically do not engage into such type of behavioral. The chapter then goes into critical theory. So there's about 7 different theories the chapter talks about at the end. The first one is legal reality theory. Chambliss claims that law is found in 2 different forms. Law can be found in books, idea of law, or in action, which is the reality of law. So law shows the gap between the rich and the powerful and the powerless, as it has been historically on the rich and the powerful side. We've typically always seen, rich people control society. That's kind of how the United States is almost run. It's all on money. You never really see anybody poor come up and become president. Typically it's somebody that has money. The next theory it kind of goes into is social reality theory. So law is unjust due to our capitalistic system, according to Richard Quinney. The powerful create crime by making laws, enforcing, oppressing lower classes, and spreading the crime ideology. 4 main factors into this is that it defines criminals as those who threaten their interest. Then it applies laws to protect interest, followed by those who are classified as the criminals are subject to facing the consequences created by the powerful. Dominant groups use this notion to spread the ideology of crime. Typically say subordinate groups are always in the wrong. You never really see somebody rich get charged with something bad. They typically enforce that on poorer people. The next theory goes into is conflict theory. So conflict theory describes how the powerful define and control the powerless as deviants. Most of this theory is derived from Marxism. The cause of deviance can be linked to the exploitative nature of capitalism. So profit increases when capitalists find ways to produce lower labor costs. For example, cheap labor is always worked by people of other nations. As we see agriculture, back in the 60s, they were getting paid not even more than $1 per hour, which basically causes that cheap labor. They're going to want more of that money. They're going to work harder, longer hours, and supposed overtime that they're probably not getting. And that's kind of how conflict theory goes into, because capitalism has always controlled the poor. Capitalism produces forms of property crimes and personal crimes like murder. So, for example, like capitalists, they can typically, you can look into fraud of these powerful people, while poor people typically are committing crimes like murder just because they don't have access to, credit cards like richer people do typically. Critical theory shifted away from the economic structure and into victimization. So crime has its roots among class, race, ethnicity, and gender. David O. Fredericks makes the point: the unequal distribution of power or of material resources within contemporary societies provide a unifying point of departure from all strains of critical criminology. Obviously, we live in a world where not everything is equal. Everything is basically distributed unevenly. The rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. Lawmakers are typically white men. You never really see people of color, and if you do, it's a very small number of them. Following that is feminist theory. All theories mentioned focus on both sexes, if not simply men. The focus of theories have always been studied on men. So socialization of men and women is different for the reason that we have always looked at male behavior and deviance. Typically, these theories look at why these men are robbing banks, why these men are killing people. It never really looks at women. Women are like men, and the theory looks into how women have strong desire for economic success, but the gap between men and women does not allow them to achieve it. Historically, women have been given less opportunities than men. Obviously, in today's world, that number has only slightly increased. We are not equal whatsoever here. Feminist theory suggests that all theories on deviance, robbers, murders, etc., are still likely to be characterized as male. Women as offenders, male, are still likely to be offenders, thus gender equality is far from reality. Most, news, we see males as the offenders. We never really see a female, and if we do, it's typically alongside a male. Feminization of poverty. More women are likely to be both heads of the household, and they're most likely to fall below the poverty line. Women, they do whatever it takes to take care of their family and make sure everything's good. And typically we do see men not, step into that role of the women. And if they do, it's very rare. Power theory, the rich and the powerful live better than the poor and the powerless. That's obviously how we live in today's society. Rich are likely to commit corporate crimes such as fraud. So the rich, they have more access to files and banks and whatnot, while the poor are more likely to commit armed robbery. So they don't really have access to, the computers that access the data, databases of a big corporation and the money they spend. So they are, most likely to commit these, robbery, arson, and whatnot. The powerful are likely to have a stronger deviant motivation. So their aspirations are likely fueled by the power and the money. Next, it goes into greater deviant opportunity. So a richer position will have easier access to acquiring large sums of money, while a poor worker will need to resort to robbing a bank, typically armed with a weapon. Like I mentioned before, if you are rich, if you are powerful, you're going to have a better position into acquiring money. If you're leading a big corporation, you are going to have access to all those files, like I said and mentioned before. Following that is weaker social control. Richer, more powerful, deviant people are likely to be more lenient, while a poor person who killed, a person may be executed. So that kind of goes into, poor people are most likely to be killed or executed immediately after, murdering somebody, and that's typically how law works these days. You never really see a rich, powerful person who owns a large corporation like Amazon or Nike or none of them. They typically don't get charged with anything. That's why we see most of their product being made overseas, so they're not typically responsible for such deviant acts. Postmodernist theory focuses on innovation, rationality, objectivity, and similar values. That represents modern science and technology. It attacks the lack of objectivity and positivism. There's deconstructionism is the demolition of something by created into components in order to be able to objectify. Linguistic domination, which says that there is a conflict in the linguistic interactions between the poor and the powerless. A poor person stealing food for their hungry family they can label themselves as being good because they're doing something for their family, while the police is going to label them as a thief. And even today, we do see these things going on in our world where people are being killed innocently while not being armed with weapons, and that's typically how it goes. You see it's different perceptions of reality. Finally, the evaluating both critical and conflict theory. Critical theorists would now argue that if an equal society is achieved, human deviance wouldn't necessarily diminish, rather they would decrease. Conflict theory looks at the motive and nature of the deviant.